Hello and welcome to the May edition of On the Horizon, our monthly podcast dedicated to helping you navigate through the tricking world of golf course turf maintenance by helping you to look and think a little further forward. I'm Henry Bechley from ICL.
And I'm Glenn Kirby from Syngenta. And Henry, I have some news.
Oh, excellent, Glenn. Are congratulations in order?
Well, we are an award-nominated podcast, Henry.
Wow, are we indeed? Is it a BAFTA?
Well, you're going to have to wait until the break. But whilst you wait in anticipation, I'm excited to say I have another poem to entertain you.
Great. It's not from the Poetry Writers Guild, is it?
No, can you just let me get on with it, please?
Okay, sorry, Glenn. Go ahead.
All right, compose yourself. Growth is here, a cause to celebrate, but cold weather looms we must anticipate. That's the conditions that will halt our stride, and from poor seed heads we cannot hide. Greenkeepers graft, for struggle is real to meet golfer expectations, a tough ordeal. But with persistence and strength, we will survive. With some good planning, we will begin to thrive.
Very good, Glenn. Do you know, you really do have a gift.
Thank you, Henry.
And so I'm wondering how you managed to project that high-pitched sound into my head, Glenn. It's really effective and genuinely quite painful.
Well, what high-pitched sound? What are you on about?
No, nothing, Glenn. Just joking. It really was very good. Okay, Glenn, let's start with the weather data for May as we move away from those April showers and all the problems that they can bring.
Indeed.
So, where are you taking us this month to get our representative weather data sample?
Well, Henry, with the King's coronation in May, I thought we should mark this historic moment with a visit to some royal golf clubs.
Oh, very good, Glenn. You know, I thought we might be going to see Coleman in County Mayo.
Okay. Royal Wimbledon first, Henry, in England. Royal County Down over in Ireland. Royal Porthcawl in Wales. And Royal Aberdeen in Scotland.
So more of a linksy flavour this month, Glenn. And just to remind everyone, we always start each month with a roundup of the recent weather patterns for selected areas to give us a kind of heads up on what the weather might bring during the month ahead. And of course, what agronomic challenges that might bring as a result.
Well, Henry, May is another month where it has the potential to be extremely challenging and pretty much anything could happen.
Yes, and we've been battling that trend since February now, haven't we? And so we have had to be on our toes as the weather has sort of swung around. March, for instance, was uncharacteristically wet for many this year.
Indeed it was. And so let's start on that moisture front for May. And we're looking at evapotranspiration in May. Now, that is starting to seriously outweigh the rainfall, with most places seeing around 80 millimetres of evapotranspiration in most Mays. Rarely does it drop below that in May. And so we can expect an average of maybe 3 mil moisture loss a day, with the hotter, windier days really kicking that number on. So with that, let's have a little look at the net losses, which is rainfall minus evapotranspiration.
Okay.
Royal Wimbledon, on average, are 68 millimetres drier at the end of the month of May than when they started. And the driest year they've seen in the last 12 years, they saw a loss of 131 millimetres, and that was 2020. The wettest Mays they've seen in recent years, they see only about a 33 millimetre loss in May.
Wow. So in the last 12 years, they've not experienced a May that wasn't drier at the end of the month than it was at the beginning.
That's right. And if we go to Royal County Down, on average, they are 27 millimetres drier at the end of the month than when they started it. And the driest year they've seen saw a loss of 82 millimetres, and that again was 2020. Okay. And the wettest Mays they've experienced are about 13 millimetres wetter at the end of the month than they were when they started.
Okay, so that is quite marginal, isn't it? And so how often are they wetter?
Well, 1 in the 12 years in this data set, they've been marginally wetter, but 2 out of those 12 years, they've been at break even.
Okay, so Royal County Down still generally drying in May the majority of the time.
Yep, that's right. Royal Porthcawl, on average, they are 25 millimetres drier at the end of the month than when they started. And in their driest year, they've seen a loss of 106 millimetres. And again, that was 2020.
Yet again. And also, I suppose we need to think about that for these coastal situations. We might also factor in like a drying breeze, for instance, that might result in moisture stress really starting to ramp up.
Indeed. And the wettest Mays for Royal Porthcawl are about a 62 millimetre net gain.
Okay, and so Porthcawl effectively have to prepare for anything in May.
That's right, again. So Royal Aberdeen up in Scotland, on average 34 millimetres drier at the end of the month than when they started. And the driest year they've seen, they saw a loss of 65 millimetres. Again, that was 2020. And the wettest Mays they get are about 37 millimetre wetter at the end of the month.
Okay, so in terms of moisture balance, Royal Porthcawl might need to prepare for either extreme. Royal Wimbledon is dry, and both Royal Aberdeen and Royal County Down are neither drying out radically, nor are they too wet either.
Yep, that's right. Location is always a big factor.
But as always, our moisture management programs will need to be in place in May because a preventative attitude to moisture management is needed at this time of year in case it turns into a dry one. Irrigation systems will need to be fully commissioned and functional. Hoses cleared out and within easy reach. Our moisture probes at the ready, and our wetting agent or surfactant programs firmly in place, especially for those drier sites in those drier areas.
Now, at this time of year, drying out can start to impact turf quality, particularly when it's coupled with the other stresses. And we could start to see some of those heat extremes in May. May can be genuinely hot on occasions, especially the further down south you go. So highest recent recorded temperatures are as high as 25 degrees at Royal Wimbledon, 27 degrees at Royal Porthcawl, 24 degrees at Royal County Down, and Royal Aberdeen have seen highest temperatures of 21 degrees.
Okay, so potentially some heat stress developing, but that would depend on the duration of those high temperatures, and I would think the extent of other compounding stresses.
Yes, we need to be careful not to overlook the power of different stresses all acting at the same time.
Yeah, and also we need to be careful what we wish for, really, because we probably all wish that summer would arrive in May, but that can occasionally cause us problems if we're not ready for it. And so we will need to keep an eye on that forecast to see what actually might unfold. But what about the other side of the coin, Glenn? What about the cold temperature extremes for May?
Okay, so the coldest temperatures we've seen are 1 degree in May down at Royal Wimbledon, -5 at Royal Porthcawl, -1 over at Royal County Down, and -3 at Royal Aberdeen.
Wow, and there's a rhyme or saying about that, isn't there?
Oh, God, I thought you'd given up on all of that.
I know. Shall I read it in Old English?
Oh, yes, please.
Right, I'll just get it. Hang on. Right. The wind at north and east was never good for man nor beast. So never think to cast a clout until the month of May be out.
Wow, that was more pirate than Old English, Henry.
I know. But anyway, this saying goes back to the 18th century, with the clout being an item of clothing, obviously, and the meaning being a reminder not to be too quick to discard your warm winter clothes before the end of May.
Yeah, I've made that mistake many times.
And it looks to be good advice, because there could also be some frosts about, couldn't there, in May, especially at the start of the month, with those lovely bright, crisp and clear spring mornings.
Indeed.
So, what is the likelihood of either, Glenn? What does the split between hot and cold look like?
That's a great question, Henry, and we kind of prepped for it beforehand. Now, I'm assuming in these numbers that hot is above 22 degrees here.
Okay.
And I'm also assuming that cold is below 3 degrees. And I've looked at how many hours a month we get on each of those. So Royal Wimbledon, on average, they see 4.25 hours a month above 22 degrees. And below 3 degrees, they see 1.25 hours a month in May, on average.
Okay, so on average, for Royal Wimbledon, the extremes of hot and cold are generally minimal in May. Not much directly stressful heat, and not too many cold hours either, which I think tells a positive story for them.
Yeah, I think so too. If we go over to Royal County Down, on average, they see 1 hour a month above 22 degrees. And below 3 degrees, they see about 5 hours a month in the month of May.
Okay, so very little of either again on average. But we still need to keep an eye on the forecast for potential extended periods of either.
Yes, we do. Royal Porthcawl in May, they see an average of 1.5 hours a month above 22 degrees and about 2.75 hours a month below 3 degrees.
Okay, so not much temperature stress or too much cold then.
No, Royal Aberdeen, on average, they see 0 hours a month above 22 degrees. Very rarely happens for them up there. And below 3 degrees, they are seeing 7.75 hours a month in May.
Okay, so cooler further north, but not much stress or a great deal of really low temperatures in May on average.
That's right. The average always hides the extremes, though, doesn't it?
Yes, they are the outer limits. So how do the overall mean average temperatures look for May then?
Okay, Royal Wimbledon, a daytime average in the month of May of 17 degrees with a nighttime average of 8.5 degrees.
Well, that sounds good.
Yeah, it sounds nice. Royal County Down, they see a daytime average of 14 degrees and a nighttime average of 6 degrees.
Yeah, we might need a jumper there. And that nighttime average actually of 6 is still very borderline, isn't it?
Yeah, wouldn't take much to push it one way or another.
No.
Royal Porthcawl, they have a daytime average of 15.5 degrees with a nighttime average of 7.5 degrees.
Yeah, not bad there.
No, and Royal Aberdeen, a daytime average of 13 with a nighttime average of 5 degrees.
Oh, yeah, so very different further north and distinctly cool at night still. So I'm thinking that down south they would need a cold spell to hold growth back, but further north looks like they need a warm spell to get things going. They're sort of in very different places, aren't they, during May in terms of growth especially?
Yeah, they are, and I think this is where a lot of people around the country start to get quite frustrated. Most of the time we're getting there in May, but unlike April where we need or where we want to see warmer temperatures to get us moving, in May we will start to see colder temperatures that are just holding things back. And we always see these weather waves that we've spoken about. And it's not until June that those kind of low points on the weather waves no longer get low enough to slow growth down. So we're kind of still waiting for June for that consistent growth to be with us.
Yeah, it is an interesting distinction between April and May, isn't it? But hopefully during May we should generally experience relatively growing conditions as the norm, but cold spells can still slow things down. And that becomes more likely the further north you go, which, as you say, could be quite frustrating if it hinders final recovery or, development of the turf. Yeah, like you say, it's not until June really that we can breathe easier and properly proceed with things unimpeded.
Indeed, that seems to be the trend.
Okay, so we said last month that we'd start looking at the Smith-Kearns model to help us get our heads around the level of dollar spot disease pressure.
Yes, that's right. I've dropped leaf wetness and sub 2 degree hours out of the weather section because they are less significant at this time of year, and we are now talking dollar spot prediction.
Yeah, it takes into account your sort of local climatic factors, doesn't it? And it calculates a level of risk. And I think that you said last month that 20% risk was the danger threshold.
I did, that's right. Once we start getting above 20%, we start moving into moderate risk. And if we're following our Smith-Kearns dollar spot model to the letter, then the first fungicide treatment should start to go down at 20%. So, as that's a kind of figure that's in there, what I thought I'd do is count on average how many days we get where we go over 20% at each location in the month of May. So we'll start with Royal Wimbledon. They see on average about 1.8 days a month where they go above 20% in May.
Okay.
A maximum they've seen in the last 12 years of 7 days, and that was in 2014 and 2012.
Well, that's actually more than I would have guessed for this time of year.
Okay, Royal County Down, on average, they see 3.25 days a month above 20%, and the highest they've seen was 10 days in the month of May, back in 2010.
Yeah, and of course I've got no frame of reference, but that also seems higher than I would have guessed as well.
And I think that's why it's so interesting looking at these models and breaking it down this way.
Yeah,
if we go to Royal Porthcawl, they see on average 3.5 days in the month of May above 20%, and they've seen as high as 12 days above 20%, and that was back in 2017.
Yeah. Those highest years are quite interesting, aren't they? They're quite, they're quite a lot of days above 20% there. Yeah.
So Royal Aberdeen, they see on average 0.4 days a month, and the maximum they've ever seen was 3 days, and that was back in 2010.
Yeah, well, that's not a surprise, is it, when we think about the temperatures and that? And that's probably what I would have guessed for everyone, if I'm being honest.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because it does start a little earlier than maybe I thought.
Yeah, it definitely looks like the pressure can start to build to some degree during May for some locations in some years. And the further south and west, it looks like that likelihood increases. And I think it might indicate that we may well see some dollar spot symptoms start to develop in May, given fairly normal conditions, but it won't or shouldn't yet spiral out of control.
Indeed. So if using that Smith-Kearns model to the letter, then fungicides might need to start for some locations in May when you see that first spike. Now, for Royal County Down and Royal Porthcawl, that's probably a 1 in 4 year thing in May. For Royal Wimbledon, that's probably a 1 in 5 year thing. And for Royal Aberdeen, it's a never thing. But I'm not sure that's necessarily the right strategy for the UK and Ireland. I think we need to think more about associating that risk figure with the amount of cultural work we do. The higher the figure, the more we need to focus on our cultural strategies.
Yes, yeah, and we generally only use fungicides on our greens, don't we? And they're actually less likely to develop dollar spot at this stage, mainly because they're generally being managed to mitigate stress and remove surface moisture, which of course would reduce the risk of attack in the low pressure conditions that we experience at this time of year.
Well, that's true, and our integrated cultural management will start reducing that level of risk quite significantly, won't it?
Yeah, and it's those sort of integrated strategies that become more and more important for the wider areas of the course because, fungicides aren't really an option for them anyway.
And we're going to talk about that a bit later on, aren't we?
Yes, we are. But how often can we be over 20% then?
Well, let's look at Royal Porthcawl, which is the most challenging site in terms of Smith-Kearns model prediction risk, and certainly the most challenging out of this 4 months locations anyway. July and August are the peak months for them of pressure, and that 20% pressure can run on until December, but maybe only a 1 in 6 chance for it to do anything in December. So in May, depending on the location, we can see maybe a 1 in 10 to a 1 in 4 chance of hitting a few days of that 20% pressure figure, which is when we start moving into the kind of moderate risk zone. But it's next month, once we start moving into June, that number really starts to ramp up.
Okay, so we're definitely going to be thinking about intensifying our integrated management strategies against Dollar Spot in June and July.
Yes, and this is when we start ramping up those cultural management, stress mitigation in all its forms, surface moisture minimisation, and the use of iron sulfate, possibly along with some surface rolling. And now I've had a really good chance to look at this model, and I think I said it earlier, I think we need to have a bit of a rethink about how we use it in the UK. And I'm not totally sure what that looks like yet. It's a great prediction model, but with so many other factors involved in it, it is just a part of the picture, like all models are. But I do feel there's better opportunities to use it in our climate, and we'll be working through that this summer.
Okay. Good. But it feels like this is already beginning to develop into a potentially challenging time.
Well, it's never easy, is it, Henry?
Well, no, it never is. Okay, so to try and summarise the potential weather picture during May, firstly, we're likely to still be experiencing stop-start growing conditions.
But probably with more start than stop, certainly for us down south.
Yes, but we might have cold overnight temperatures in particular that might be holding things back. The degree of stop or start is strongly influenced by your location, as you were just saying, but it will also obviously be affected just by, how the weather drops this year.
Yeah, let's not forget, we've looked at the averages and anything can happen in May.
Yeah, and that means it can be the most difficult and frustrating time, especially if we're still trying to get the course up to its very best.
Indeed, consistent growth is nearly here, but not quite.
Yeah, and those stresses are potentially building and maybe compounding each other if we're not careful.
Yes, there's high potential for it to be dry already, although we did have a wet March for most, which, whilst frustrating at the time, may well have just saved us as we went into this drying period with some decent soil moisture levels. Yeah. There is some potential for some occasional heat stress at times to couple up with that drought stress in May. The odds of summer arriving are fairly good, but they're not guaranteed. And the Smith-Kearns model telling us we're in a 1 in 4 chance for some and a 1 in 10 chance for others of moving into some kind of low dollar spot pressure.
During May, summer will hopefully come into view, but this might be the time when we could see some other pressures really starting to build. Okay, as we do this, Glenn, it seems that every month is shaping into a tough one. But how does May in particular stack up in terms of player expectations? Are we getting there? And are the golfers happy yet?
Well, most will be. A few won't. There's been enough growth to make it look pretty good for most of the time now. We should have been through a few really decent growth waves by now. And that growth and a bit of definition is enough to satisfy the masses, but maybe not the few.
Yes, we can get growth kicking in earnest in May, but experience tells me that we're still not out of the woods yet, and that it will be a month of 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
Yes, and of course we need to be mindful of the bank holidays coming up in May too.
Yes, and if they land in a difficult period, we might not be able to deal with things as soon as we would want to. And of course we've got annual meadowgrass seed heads to contend with, and all the grief that brings.
Absolutely. Those shorter working hours at a time golfers really want to play and can all compound the issues, and it needs some very good management.
Yes.
We could easily see an abundance of growth during those long weekends that might cause some problems around the course, with things being neglected or a large amount of grass clippings lying around after mowing. And golfers don't like any of those things.
No, they don't. It really is a difficult time, isn't it? And what about seed establishment at this time?
Yeah, things like lack of recovery can cause conflicts with golfers who don't understand how the temperatures are still a limiting factor.
Yes, and the weeds, they will also have been taking advantage of the emergent growing conditions too. What are the golfers' view on weeds, do you think, Glenn? Are they a red flag?
I don't think golfers are very tolerant of weeds when they notice them, but many of them, from my experience, don't notice them as long as they're kept at tolerable levels. They certainly don't notice them on the same level that we do when we're out being hypercritical.
Yeah.
Things like dandelions can tend to evoke a reaction because of their bright yellow flowers and how obvious they are. And while control of those is fairly easy, it's a tricky species to target because it's usually a little too early for the other weed species.
Yeah.
They tend to prompt a bit of emotion because they're so obvious. It's an attention to detail thing, and it's going to vary from site to site. Some sites need to be immaculate in their presentation. Others have a more rustic appeal where some weeds here and there will fit in with the environment. The last course I managed was a bit like that. A few daisies in the fairways was perfectly acceptable to my members, but a bit of clover in the rough, that was a whole different story. If one golfer felt they'd lost their golf ball in that stuff, then there was all sorts of problems.
Yeah. Well, that is understandable, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Clover, when allowed to get above ball height, is a pain. And also we get a bit of feedback about stinging nettles in the rough, generally where historically greenkeepers had been dumping their grass clippings on a regular basis, creating an annual problem for that particular species for forever after.
Yeah, but they are, stinging nettles are important for pollinators, aren't they?
They are. There's a place for everything. And as always, there is loads to consider.
Okay, so in May, to keep the golfers happy, we will probably need to be thinking about our weed management strategy.
Indeed, on top of everything else.
Okay, so from a golfer's point of view, May is the time when the greens need to be coming good and the wider course filling out and sort of tidying up, and definition is starting to really get there. And of course, that lovely smell of cut grass pointing towards summer. But the golfers probably won't have any conception of all the significant challenges that are coming into play at this time that might well cause backward steps or hinder recovery. We've got seed heads in the greens. We've got worn areas being slow to recover. We've got those weeds popping up, and we've got hardly any time to do anything.
That's absolutely right. So it's one of the easier months then, Henry. And the temptation, of course, is going to be to push at full tilt no matter what.
Yes, and that can cause problems in itself.
Yeah, and so it's not just the environmental pressures that cause us problems in May, is it?
No, it isn't. We've got the pressure of impatience or eagerness. They're both at play now as well.
Yeah, and we can be our own worst enemy here. We must just be honest with ourselves and ask, are golfers demanding these high standards that we keep pushing for, or is it us? Is it just a favour-winning exercise, or, have we delivered all winter and did things slip a little and we're just trying to recover a bit of kind of club momentum and a bit of positivity? Did diseases catch us out? And are we now just pedalling harder to deliver on that promise that we made all winter?
Yes. I mean, we've got to try not to beat ourselves up too much because, life's hard enough. But we do all need to reflect on our motivation sometimes.
We do indeed.
So I'm just off to pop my own ego, Glenn.
So, Henry, what are the agronomic risks that we may encounter in May?
Well, Glenn, the agronomic risks will to some degree be dependent on how the weather conditions shake down at this time. It could be wet, it could be dry, hot, mild, or even cold, as we discussed. And we are not forced to have fully established consistent growth yet by the end of the month. And so we could still be really battling hard to get those surfaces together. Hopefully the growth waves will be significant and meaningful at this time to help us all finish things off, but then they're not forced to be. Ultimately, I think our agronomic mindset needs to be that May is still a building month. We need to create a solid foundation for the year ahead during this time. And that means not pushing too hard. Or too soon, or if conditions aren't suitable.
No, and although maybe not too extreme, May can bring stresses, can't it? Or even constraints to growth. And they come in many different forms to hold things back at this late stage.
Yeah, and also the management factors, as we were just saying, will be influential. Overly intensive maintenance, for example, can cause us problems, which is why each month, we tried to tread quite a steady path agronomically.
Yeah, those player or club expectations can be really damaging at this time by forcing or encouraging the intensification of those management pressures. And at a time when, due to conditions, the turf's just not always ready or able to withstand it.
Yes, and even if conditions aren't particularly stressful, i.e. it's mild and damp, then the development of microdochium patch disease might still become an issue.
Yeah, that can happen every now and again in May. Growth is now just around the corner, so there is rightfully a hesitancy when reaching for fungicides in this period of the year. But a good forecast should tell you what sort of pattern you're in. And as always, an early positive application is always going to be better than a delayed one.
Yeah, well, yes, it is. And we might as well cover that off, I suppose. So if we're going to go with a fungicide, what's the go-to product for microdochium patch disease control at this time of year?
Well, we're bang in Instrata Elite or FR321 territory, or over in Ireland, they have a Cernity that they can reach for. But the thing to do here is set your own thresholds and recognise what you're prepared to tolerate. Whilst it's likely that recovery is only a few days away, it is possible that in May, the conditions conducive to disease development can linger, and the recovery days are possibly further away than you hope. So set yourself a threshold, watch the weather like a hawk, and take firm and positive action when you feel you need to.
Yeah, recovery growth might be in the game, but on the other side of the coin, we might go into a stressful period. And then annual meadowgrass seeding might start up in earnest, or anthracnose become an issue if we're pushing too hard with our cutting heights.
Yeah, it really is a tough time agronomically, and we do need to try and navigate the safest route.
And so for the greens in particular, we're trying to progress with turf quality, but maybe without that consistent growth being fully established. And so we do need to be careful when and if we go all in with our surface preparation.
And you're going to touch on playing quality targets later on, aren't you?
Yes, in a way, because they can really help us stop going overboard too soon.
Okay, so growth is the key, and it determines how far we can jump into those surface preparations without encountering problems.
That's right. So nutritionally, we are still looking to build that solid foundation in terms of rooting and sward density. And so we still need some substance in our fertility plan. We might be carrying some granular nutrition through into May from applications made in April, which you may or may not need to top up in May, depending on whether it will be sufficient to support your agronomic objectives through this time.
Yes, this is when you need to be familiar with your fertiliser release patterns, just to make sure that it doesn't run out just when you might need it.
Yeah, and of course this is where our field team can really help you if you just want to give them a bell. But in terms of the magnitude of the response, given reasonable growing conditions, we like to think in terms of the average units of nitrogen per hectare that is being delivered each week. So for the greens, if there are still significant renovations to complete for whatever reason, you may need to deliver 5 to 6 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per week over, say, a 3 to 4 week period. And so that might be achieved by using something like a granular Greenmaster Pro Light Turf Tonic 800, which would need to be applied at 25 grams per metre squared. But if you need steady growth to allow an element of final recovery and things like the incorporation of top dressing or the ability to withstand and recover from verticutting, then a lower level of 3 to 4 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per week might be needed through the month. And so this could be achieved using something different, like the Sierra Form GT K step 6027, which contains slow release nitrogen and slow release potassium, again applied at 25 to 30 grams per meter squared. If, on the other hand, and lucky you, if all is done and you don't need to create too much growth and a quiet response is the order of the day, then you might be wanting to set the nutritional delivery at around 2 or maybe 3 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per week, which could be achieved with the K-step again applied at a lower rate of 20 to 25 grams per meter squared, and that would release over, say, maybe 5 to 6 weeks. But you might, at this time, if you're looking to deliver that level of nutrition, be thinking about moving over to liquids or solubles. The Sportsmaster water-soluble fertilizer 2000 plus SMX, which is our concentrated seaweed applied at 30 to 40 kilograms per hectare, would be able to deliver that over a 3-week period. But we do need to be careful not to underdo it at this time. You know, we're trying to build a foundation, aren't we? Because this is also the time when annual meadowgrass might begin to divert its energy into seeding, which can really take the guts out of the sward and result in a decline in sward density if your fertility program is not sufficient. You know, this level of input is only really likely to be appropriate for fine grass dominated links or heathland situations that are well set and don't really have a lot of early season work to complete. As always, just do what you need to and keep an eye on things and make adjustments if necessary.
Yes, indeed. Annual meadowgrass seeding is also becoming a big issue in May, and that will impact both the visual and the playing qualities of greens, won't it?
Yes. They create a huge backward step in surface quality for a number of really painful weeks around about this time. And so we would want to minimise that if possible.
And that is being primarily achieved with the use of plant growth regulators prior to the period of seed head production, along with a bit of mechanical work to reduce the impact on that playing surface.
And we have a couple of plant growth regulators to choose from now, don't we? And I think you're going to touch on that a little later on, as well as the broader picture of ongoing plant growth regulation with Primo Max and where we're at with getting into our programs and frequency of application.
I am indeed.
Chafer and leather jacket activity might still be occurring at this time, or more seriously, that secondary damage from birds and badgers, etc. And so we might be trying deterrence where appropriate, or continuing our nutrition and moisture management strategies that we discussed last month in order to try and ease the pain. But it might just be that renovation is needed, which can be really problematic at this time in unirrigated areas during dry spells of weather for the reasons previously discussed.
And on the chafer front, we'll want to be mapping and logging those damaged areas from the winter damage to help guide this year's strategy. And we're also beginning to keep an eye open for the next generation of those chafer beetles emerging. Treatments aren't quite yet, but certainly something to monitor for. So log that damage, monitor the beetle emergence, and tune into next month's podcast for a deep dive into chafers.
Great. In terms of moisture balance, we've already discussed that turf drying or droughting can be quite a common issue during May, and so we will need to continue with our surfactant programs and irrigate, maybe being guided with soil moisture monitoring. And don't forget that general plant health can have a huge impact on drought tolerance, and so nutrition should be a consideration as well, especially on impoverished sites that are prone to drying out, and we discussed that last month when we were talking about Dollar Spot.
And in May, we might start to see some of that dollar spot developing, especially on more vulnerable sites and during the warmer snaps of weather that we could get.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about dollar spot a little later on too, aren't we?
Yes, there's actually lots to think about in May, isn't there, Glenn?
There is, and weeds start coming to the fore as well, so they will need some control too.
Yes, and you're going to talk about that a bit later on, because timing and application can have a big influence on levels of weed control.
Yes, there's plenty going on in May and an extra bank holiday to contend with.
Yes, the coronation. Anyway, so agronomically, May is a time for spinning plates, it feels like. We need to get the course ready, but during a time when the conditions might still not be ideal. You know, we want to make forward progress, but there are plenty of ways in which we can stumble back agronomically. The weather conditions could be distinctly wintry or feel like the height of summer, and so we will need to have robust strategies in place to be able to cope with these varying challenges. And to top it all off, we have all those bank holidays going on, bringing out the golfers, but also cutting down our course maintenance time.
I was always glad to see the back of May.
Yes, Glenn, it really is a tough time.
So that's it for part one, Henry. We have challenging conditions, expectant golfers, and a whole host of agronomic issues, all alongside a month cut short by bank holidays.
Yes, it's a tough one, Glenn.
I really don't miss it, Henry.
Yeah.
So in part two, we're going to be talking weed management, dollar spot, primo intervals, planning a growth degree day program, and incorporating seeds. Yeah. And you're going to touch on playing quality targets. We start our Anthracnose marathon, and then there is the much maligned application tip of the month.
Blimey, Glenn, I better get the kettle on because we're going to need a cup of tea if we're going to get through all that. So, welcome back to part two of the May edition of the On the Horizon podcast. So, what have you been up to since part one, Glenn?
Well, I've been pretty productive, actually, Henry. I've been out for a run, cut the lawn, emptied the dishwasher.
Very good, Glenn. That's the brownie point secured for at least 5 minutes.
I did break a cup, though. What about you? What have you been up to?
Oh, dear. Well, I've managed to read the new turf maintenance bestseller, Achieving Sustainable Turfgrass Management by Professor Mike Fidanza.
Well done, Henry. I've got mine here, but I haven't started it yet. Ooh. Is it any good?
Very good, Glenn.
Nothing else to say about it?
Well, it's certainly a thriller, Glenn, but I wouldn't want to spoil the ending for you.
I just presumed it had something to do with the achievement of sustainable turfgrass management.
I can't tell you, Glenn. I've already said too much.
It's becoming a mystery, Henry.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm wondering where the turf nutrition is, but I have really said too much. You need to read it for yourself, but it is very good. Okay, so what can we look forward to in part two, Henry? Well, it's also a blockbuster month, Glenn, with weeds, pests and diseases all featuring, along with seed heads, playing quality target, subplots, and then the ultimate twist in the tail that is your application tip of the month.
It's a good one this month, Henry.
It always is, Glenn. I never see it coming.
But first it's time for a tea break. What are you drinking this month, Henry?
Well, generally we are on Co-op's 99 blend, loose leaf and cheap as chips.
Oh, any good?
Yeah, it's a straightforward brew, strong and slightly malty, but you need to be careful not to let it stew.
Well, that does sound like a step in the right direction.
Yes, it's very nice. But a few days ago, we had something of an epiphany, Glenn. Ed reckons we may have even broken through the fourth wall.
Blimey, what is it?
Moroccan peppermint and green tea, Glenn, with a bit of honey. Honestly, it's like we've been asleep all our lives. Just like that, we've started seeing things for how they really are.
Oh no, Andy Owen's been in the office, hasn't he? I can see his fingerprints all over this one. Peppermint, the addition of honey to tea. Keep an eye out for him, Henry. He'll take you down a dark path.
He still denies that accusation, Glenn. And actually, it was nothing to do with him. But Andy has tried it, and he gave it a sage nod.
A sage nod, eh? That's about as good as it gets from Andy. Anyway, yes. I am bound to ask you, how are things really?
Well, it's a mixed bag, isn't it, Glenn? Anyway, how about you? What are you on this month?
Still rocking the instant, Henry. It is what it is.
Yeah, and you mentioned an award nomination, Glenn.
Indeed. For the second year running, Henry, we have been nominated within Syngenta for the Excellence in Communication Award.
Wow, excellence in communication, Glenn. What an honour that would be. I am discomfited with stupefaction, Glenn. So how do we do?
You're going to need to hang on to the end to find out.
But methinks you might be aggrandising the degree of intrigue that our gathered throng would reserve for the proclamation of such an undoubted honour, Glenn.
You're just going to have to wait and find out, Henry. Anyway, with it being May, I was thinking that you'd be gearing up for this year's Eurovision Song Contest.
Well, I certainly am, Glenn. It's one of the highlights of the year. And let's say it's the musical equivalent of the Masters, Glenn, only slightly less camp.
OK, do you want to give us a bit of a rundown on what to expect?
Yeah, if you insist. It will be spectacular, bonkers, and it is always brilliant. It is the joyful celebration of all our unity and diversity in 3 minutes of song and dance where pretty much anything goes. It will be like the best cheese dream that you've ever had. Yeah,
I watched it last year and I thought it was very cheesy, but great as well. Nothing like the rubbish I remember it being.
Yes, it's quite a show these days, or shows actually, because there are 2 semi-finals as well as the final. But be aware that the semi-finals can also be a mixed bag and are probably only for the enthusiasts. But the final is always a very special treat.
Well, it's certainly a long night with the voting at the end. So what about the politics of that voting?
Well, pretty much eliminated now, I would say. There will be a bit of it. Greece and Cyprus will give each other 12 points, given the chance. But the audience vote tends to decide it all now anyway.
So you don't think there's any conspiracy against the UK then?
Oh, definitely not. The reason why we've generally done badly in recent years is because we've entered relatively uninspiring or quite weak songs. Ireland have struggled in recent years for the same reason. This year they've gone anthemic.
But Sam Ryder last year shone through for us.
Yes, he did. And he actually won the jury vote. But in the end, Ukraine won because of a landslide audience vote, which is a deliciously cruel way of ending the evening. But in the end, the right choice is generally made to make some kind of sense to all the madness.
And it's in Liverpool this year because of the war in Ukraine, and with Sam coming runner-up last year.
Yes, it is, which is exciting. This year's theme is United in Music.
Yeah, and will you be going?
Well, me and my son Charles have managed to get tickets for the jury shows, which are their dress rehearsals held the day before the live shows, and they are the ones that the juries vote on. And so we are doubly looking forward to it this year. Will you be watching again, Glenn?
Certainly will. I think Mrs. K is insisting on a village Eurovision party at our house. Fancy dress and everything. Well, at least I think that's what's happening. She keeps telling me I don't listen, and I think she's probably right.
Yeah, she is.
Come on, Anne. Any thoughts on potential winners?
Well, I'm no good at predicting the winner, but Charles reckons that Sweden, Finland, Norway, Austria and France all stand a good chance of winning. But it's another strong year, and of course the performance has a big part to play. So we will need to wait for the shows before deciding. Good work, Charles. The nation's greenkeepers are going to be down the bookies on the back of your advice. Good luck, mate. He doesn't think UK or Ireland then? Unlikely this year, I'm afraid, Glenn. Charles says that maybe top 10 at best for the UK. I'm not sure about that. And fingers crossed for Ireland reaching the final as well. Germany, they've gone all in with quite a hard rock entry. I always really like Italy. Croatia might end up being the most bonkers, but that's always quite a crowded field. And so we'll just have to wait and see. I would say, I think Serbia, Denmark, Estonia, and Switzerland would be my outside each way bets. But, my track record on this is extremely poor.
But it doesn't really matter who wins anyway, does it?
No, exactly, Glenn. It is what it is. It's a bit of fun.
It is indeed. And there's no need to spoil that ending either.
We've already said too much, Glenn.
Okay, Henry, it's weed season. Spring has sprung,
Hey.
Some growth has arrived, and we need to start thinking about our weed management programs.
Yes, or the golfers will not be happy. And Syngenta have a new selective herbicide for us all this year, don't they?
Indeed, Overtake, it's a broad spectrum selective herbicide with common daisy, common dandelion and white clover on the label. It contains fluroxapyr and flurazolam, and it's nice on a number of fronts. Firstly, it's great to get a registration through at the moment. That is challenging, particularly on herbicides.
Yep.
And it's our first selective herbicide to the market. So it's really nice to be in that space. And it gives me a bit of license to start talking about weed management and talk about the lots and lots of trial work that we've done. And it's going to be good to share that with people. And lastly, it's a good, solid product and one that Sean and myself are looking forward to supporting this year.
Yes. Okay, so when we're thinking about the use of selective herbicides, what should we be taking into account in order to get the best out of them?
Well, number one for me is water volumes, Henry. We've spent a lot of time spraying Overtake at different water volumes to try and understand what sort of impact that had on the efficacy of these products.
Oh, and so what did you find?
Well, optimum water volume for Overtake is 200 litres a hectare. At 200 litres a hectare across the 21 trials that I looked at this, we saw about an average across all the weed species we were looking at of 85% control. If we went lower on that water volume, down to 125 litres a hectare, we saw that efficacy drop off to about 50% control, which is a big drop. And then if we move the other way up to 500 litres a hectare, we drop down to 60% control.
Wow, so water volume really does have a big impact on the performance of herbicides like Overtake.
Yeah, it's a massive impact. And in a recent survey we did, we found that most people were applying selective herbicides at 400 litres a hectare. And we suspect that's mainly for safety concerns. They were worried about lower water volumes on them. But it has an impact on how effective they are. Now, we've seen no safety issues at all with Overtake, even at the low water volumes of 125 litres a hectare. So it's super safe to use at those low water volumes, and it's most effective at 200 litres a hectare.
Very good. And so what about timings? Any advice there?
Well, the more juvenile the weed, the better the control. And this is highlighted by our spring versus autumn work. Spring is better than autumn. We've done a load of work looking at spring versus autumn timings, and what I found particularly interesting was the different levels of control. If we take daisy, for example, with our spring applications across all our trials, we found we got about an average of 80% control in the spring. But if we applied the same product at the same rate in the autumn, we found we only got about 40% control.
Oh, so a massive drop in efficacy with regard to timing as well.
Absolutely. We saw the same trends across all the weeds that we did trial work on. White clover, we saw 90% control in the spring. That dropped to about 70% control in the autumn. So the first key with selective herbicides, or certainly the ones I've trialled, is that spring applications are far more effective than autumn ones. And that's because of the younger, more juvenile weed that we are targeting.
Yes.
It hasn't matured and hardened off over those summer months.
Excellent. So it's spring application then.
Indeed, but spring is tricky, isn't it? We don't want to be going too early, as that means that we could be missing weeds that haven't yet germinated. So we're waiting for all of our target weeds to be there.
Yeah.
But we don't want to go too late, as that will mean some weeds would be more mature than we would like.
Yeah, it is a tricky business getting that timing absolutely right, isn't it?
It is. I always remember one club I worked at where the general manager was determined that we sprayed for dandelions, as the yellow flowers really really annoyed him. And when we did target those dandelions, we ended up going too early for the other weeds. So we needed to put out 2 applications. Yeah. So what we ended up doing, Henry, was hand-picking the yellow flowers in front of his office to keep him happy. It just seemed a more sustainable solution. But the team did hate me for that one.
Well, an unconventional approach there, Glenn, but a good one, I think. And of course, our weed control strategy should be fully integrated and also involving things like nutrition to minimise gaps for those weeds to exploit. And actually, Andy has been doing some nice work with the Dutch greenkeeper group, High Flip, in this very area that we might be able to get him to report back on at some point.
It'd be great to see him. Plant growth regulators like Primo can help with that too, just helping to tighten down that sward.
Okay, good. And so while we're on that subject, is there any data to support the tank mixing of Primo Max with Overtake?
Well, we have looked into this and we did see some phyto. Not much, but some, so we would not recommend it.
Okay.
However, it was minimal, so you could do it if it meant you could get 2 applications down at once to save time and you were pressured.
Yes.
But I would only do it if you're prepared to risk some yellowing. And then it could be something you could do, but only if you're prepared to make that compromise. A little nitrogen should negate that, but in our trial, it didn't.
So, 200 litres per hectare and apply it in spring to get the best out of Overtake.
That's the one, Henry. Okay, Henry, we are continuing to highlight Dollar Spot this month.
Yes, we are, Glenn, and that is because we view this disease as being an increasing threat because the weather conditions seem to be becoming more and more conducive to its development, and more courses are being affected by it.
Yes, it's on the march, but we think that we might be able to mitigate its impact with some preemptive strategies during these early development stages, and we've noted that the pressure is beginning in May, but we would really only expect it to develop in earnest later on in the summer.
Yes, it really sort of thrives in the higher temperatures and humidity levels that we would normally see later on in the summer and not in May. But even though we might not be in its absolute sweet spot during May, it can still develop in suboptimal conditions. And so we might see the first signs of activity, especially on previously affected sites.
And this tends to be on the wider areas of the course, tees, approaches, surrounds, fairways, rather than greens, doesn't it?
Yes, the less intensively maintained areas in general. But these are also the larger areas, which makes control especially difficult. And so we need to try and get in front of it with our integrated management strategies to try to minimise its impact where possible.
And we discussed stress mitigation strategies last month, soil moisture management and fertility mainly, which would be especially important for vulnerable or previously affected sites.
Yes, and we're not talking about control here, but just trying to almost like minimise the severity or the extent of any outbreaks, because things like mitigating turf stress and maintaining plant health can help keep things in check when the disease pressure is at this low level.
That's right. We're trying to slow it down at this stage.
Yes, and we discussed the different options for nutrition, control release fertiliser versus liquid sprays, and the use of surfaction technologies last month. And we mentioned that when the pressure increases, we would then want to focus more on things like surface moisture reduction, it being one of the key drivers for the disease, and maybe consider the use of sulfate of iron, and maybe incorporating surface rolling where possible or practical.
Yes, so physical dew removal becomes more important, which will be achieved with regular mowing on intensively managed areas, or switching and brushing of tees, collars and surrounds, or maybe even rope dragging on the fairways on days where they aren't being mown. They should all be considered. And extending the scope of your turf ironing as well with your rolling, That also might enter the game if the pressure starts to build.
Yes, and we've started thinking about using the Smith-Kearns model, which factors in our, your own climatic conditions to gauge the level of risk and help us decide whether an upscaling of your management strategy is needed. So let's recap. Where might we be in terms of risk at this time of year, Glenn?
We spoke earlier about May being the first month where we start to see some pressure, didn't we?
Yes, and so at what point do you think that we might need to move towards upscaling our maintenance strategy?
Well, if we look to our worst areas of the country,
Devon and Cornwall, I'm thinking.
Yeah, that I thought it'd be interesting to see how the hotspots play out over the course of a year.
Yes.
Now, in Devon and Cornwall, they average about 5 days above 20% in May.
Yeah.
Once you move into June, that goes up to 19 days above 20%. In July, they average 26 days above 20%.
Whoa.
In August, which is the peak of it for them, 27 days at over 20%.
Wow.
Drops down to 20 days in September, 13 days in October, 6 days in November, and 2 in December.
Well, it really is high levels of disease pressure, and it goes on late, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is brutal in some areas.
Okay, so whilst dollar spot disease pressure can begin to build in May, we're still at low pressure levels generally. But we really start to see it ramp up in June, with a peak coming in July and August.
Yes, and potential for it to drag into December in some years if that infection gets away from us. So we need to hold it through those pressure months. And I'd say for those who have a historical challenge with this problem, let's bookmark the middle of May as our starting point for upping our dollar spot game.
Because we're needing to get in front of the game and slow down the development of the disease as well as we can. Out of interest, Glenn, at what point do we think that the pressure will be at such a high level that would render our non-fungicidal integrated methods ineffective?
Well, if we think back to last month, we said with values below 20 indicating a low risk of dollar spot, values between 20 and 40 indicating a moderate risk, and values over 40 indicating a high risk.
Okay.
And I'm fairly comfortable with that at the moment. It's early days in my understanding of this model, but I think all the time we're under 40%. We are manageable.
Okay.
But one spike above 40% is probably less of a problem than 30 days in a row of kind of 20%. And we must remember that all sites are different. A tree-lined course with dew that hangs around a long time and has dry soils with thatchy surfaces will see much higher dollar spot pressure than a course that has great airflow, low thatch levels and good soil moisture. But as a rule, I'd say if we get right on top of those kind of cultural practices, I think we're fine until we hit 40%, over 40%, and I think we're then in trouble.
Yeah, there's a lot more to be taken into account, really, isn't there? And I think we're all probably going to spend this year getting our heads around it a lot better. But I think that's a good starting point. And we need to keep an eye on that, and we need to start looking at when we get, up to 40%, don't we? June, July and August for different areas. Okay, but if the point of the Smith-Kearns model is to trigger fungicide application, what fungicide should we use if we want to protect those important areas?
Okay, if we need to go for fungicides on this one, which most won't because generally it's a problem on larger areas and a job for cultural management.
Yes.
But some who will have seen historic pressure on greens or maybe need to do a bit more on teas to hold them at an acceptable level, then the fungicide list is fairly short. Heritage, which is a very broad spectrum fungicide, is relatively ineffective on dollar spot. We only get about 50% control. But it's interesting to see that some azoxystrobins out there have it on the label.
Yes.
There you go. Instratorelli is a lot better on it.
Yes.
Acernity is also really good, and that's available over in Ireland. Ooh. And there's a couple of products in our competitors' armoury that can really support in programs.
Okay, but we're certainly not at the fungicide stage yet.
No, but it will depend on the weather and the susceptibility of the site. Some places with susceptible greens may need to start thinking about it in some maize.
Yeah. Maybe thinking in general terms isn't that helpful. You've got to be sort of, judge your own site on its own merits. But right. At the moment, generally, we're just starting to, we're just looking to minimise the risk by getting our background maintenance set and by monitoring the situation out in the field, and also using the Smith-Kearns model to maybe help direct the timing of an escalation of our management strategy when the pressure starts to build. And we reckon that might well be sort of mid-May onwards.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so we have a plan, Glenn.
So, our 2023 Anthracnose Prevention Integrated Turf Management Strategy Marathon starts here, Henry.
Well done, Glenn. Yes, it does. And this year we thought we'd start with a general run through to get our heads in the right place for the year ahead.
Oh, a bit of a team talk.
Well, kind of. But we do need to be really clear on this, actually, because anthracnose is one of those diseases that can be self-inflicted.
Okay, so we need to stay super focused, because if it enters the game, anthracnose can be extremely damaging, can't it?
Yes.
But we know that it can be effectively managed with a good agronomic strategy.
Yes, but if the greens maintenance strategy is focused heavily on extremely low cutting heights in pursuit of extended ball roll distances, then you need to be on especially high alert.
Okay, that is clear. So where do we start?
Well, at the beginning, Glenn, anthracnose is potentially an extremely damaging turf disease caused by the fungal pathogen Coletotrichum cereale.
Easy for you to say.
Coletotrichum cereale. Oh, Coletotrichum cereale.
Very good.
Yes, I did it. It causes damage to its host by utilising the plant tissue to fuel its own reproductive cycle. It can affect the foliage, i.e. foliar blight, or the crowns, which would be basal rot. It is characterised generally by yellowing of the affected areas as they die back, but blackening can also be seen up close, and these are the fungal fruiting bodies. Anthracnose is a disease that primarily affects annual meadowgrass, Poa annua, but it can also affect bent grasses too. The development of the disease is related to the level of plant stress being caused by either environmental or management factors, hot, dry, or even excessively wet conditions, but also impoverished turf or overly intensive levels of management. Excessively low cutting heights. And so greens that are kept lean but are still being intensively maintained are at a particular risk.
But there has been a lot of collaborative research work done on anthracnose in the States, isn't there, that shows an integrated management strategy that still attends to ball roll can greatly reduce the severity of an attack.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant stuff, actually, isn't it? And we've talked about that in previous years.
We have.
And so, learning from that, our integrated anthracnose management strategy should focus on minimising the level of turf stress and preparing our surfaces without putting them under too much pressure by mowing them too low in particular.
Okay, well, that sounds like our overall agronomic plan, Henry.
Yeah, it is. The development of anthracnose can actually be an agronomic indicator that our program is out of balance, or that we're maybe pushing too hard or not doing enough in certain areas.
Okay, so let's quickly unpack those factors. What about optimizing nutrition?
Well, if we're looking to minimise the development of anthracnose in annual meadowgrass or creeping bentgrass swards, then we are looking to provide enough nutrition to prevent the sward from weakening under maintenance and play. If we're thinking of broad benchmark figures, then I think in the UK and Ireland, on reasonable constructions, our annual nitrogen inputs would be something in the region of 110 to 140 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year for annual meadowgrass dominated swards, and maybe 80 to 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year for creeping bentgrass dominant swards. There might be local factors that cause the actual figures to be slightly higher or lower, but that's sort of a general guideline. But as we have previously discussed, we also like to think of nutrition in terms of weekly inputs, and generally we tend to run at an average of around 2 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per week during the playing season. But we might look to boost this as we go into periods of heightened anthracnose risk, which tends to be in June and July. And that is probably because the greens are starting to run out of steam at what are quite low in reality background levels of nutrition that we tend to run at. And so the advice is to make sure not to let the turf start the season in a weakened state. So that's why we use our granulars in the spring, and then top up later in the summer, possibly with another granular on the run up to the high risk period. And this would be to temporarily boost the nitrogen level up to maybe 4 to 5 kilograms of nitrogen per week, just for a short period before allowing it to drop back down again. And this is where your primo scheduling that you're going to talk about a little bit later on, Glenn, is really important, because we want to use that to make sure that we've got the frequency timings dialed in to really help iron out those playing qualities at different levels of nutrition.
That's right. So I'm going to start on that particular journey a little later on.
Great.
Now, in terms of nutrition, though, you are saying not to go too lean too early.
Yes, make sure that you've allowed the swards to build a foundation of reserves before you start leaning in. May is still a building month, remember.
Okay, and so moisture management, or the avoidance of damaging moisture stress, and the development of localised dry patch, is about our preventative surfactant program and our targeted irrigation strategy being guided by the use of moisture probes.
Yeah, in terms of moisture management, we just need to work to targets. Generally, 20 to 25% volumetric moisture content for annual meadowgrass dominated parkland settings, and a little lower, maybe 15 to 20% for fine grass dominated heathlands and links. If you can't operate to those tolerances, assuming that your readings are accurate without the greens plummeting, then it might be that you're out of balance in terms of other compounding stresses.
Like height cut, maybe?
Yeah, it could be, but it could be that the greens are being run too lean, maybe, or the soil profile might have issues, or obviously the environmental pressures could be dominant.
Okay, so what about surface preparations? This is where you want them to be guided by monitoring as well, isn't it? And working towards targets.
Yes, that's right. Last month we talked about data collection from an agronomist's perspective, well, my perspective, and to only take readings that are helpful and that tell you what to do, really. And I found the measurement of green speed and the scoring of surface smoothness to be invaluable with regard to sort of setting an appropriate management intensity, especially at this time of year. If we can agree our targets for both speed and smoothness and just work towards them, then it really helps prevent a blind escalation of management intensity, that is always in search of more.
Okay, and so what about setting targets?
Well, if you can measure it or score it, then you can target it. And targets are needed if you want to take the argument or the heat out of the situation. In terms of green speed or ball roll distance using a stimp meter, your target will vary throughout the year, and it will be influenced by things like the style of the course, the contouring of the greens, the resources available, and of course those player expectations or requirements. And the target might actually vary throughout the week with different demographics or specific events being played at different times. The R&A's best practice handbook suggests that for routine play, the green speed target might range from 8 foot to 9'6". And so in May, you should probably be somewhere between the two, just as an example. And the key with having a defined target is that you work simply to deliver it rather than constantly pushing the boundary for more, which is what leads to problems. So it's a more confident and considered mindset, but your targets do need to be agreed by all.
But speed is only half of the story, isn't it?
Yes, well, it should be. It should be less than half the story, actually, but quite often green speed is regarded as being the only story. And this is what creates the problem with anthracnose.
Yes, because a sole focus on speed usually means shaving down those heights of cut, which with the new heavier cutting units are often cutting well below the bench setting.
Yeah.
And this is a key driver for the development of the disease.
Yes. Yeah, we might think that we're in a safe area with our bench settings, but actually we might be in the danger zone and cutting well below our intended level.
Yes, so get those prisms out, people. I know they aren't easy to use, but from what I've seen, they are only hard to read when the quality of cut is all over the place. And if you've got lots of stragglers that aren't being swept up by those reels. So those people that reject this as a measuring method because they think it's too difficult to read are usually the ones that need to focus on it most. A well set up mower is more than simply just making sure it cuts paper. There is so much more involved. And when you get it right, those prisms give a really clear indication of actual cutting height. Getting that right means the focus moves from dropping those heights to quality setup. So speed and smoothness, that will all come from good quality mower setup. Now, you think that the focus should be on smoothness over speed, don't you?
Well, the focus should also be on smoothness, Glenn, and for two main reasons. Firstly, a smoother surface will result in increased ball roll distance. It's how you improve the green speed. But the shift in focus towards smoothness is hugely significant agronomically because the methods that we choose to improve surface smoothness, things like top dressing, brushing, maintaining plant health, plant growth regulation, rolling or turf ironing, etc., they aren't factors that encourage the development of anthracnose.
And so you think people should also be looking at scoring the surface smoothness when taking those green speed readings, using the STRI smoothness scale, because that will help reduce problems like anthracnose occurring while still delivering the desired surface.
Yeah, you know, whilst you're taking the speed of the green, you score the smoothness of the ball roll. It's quite simple, really, to see how it can be improved, or essentially what needs to be done to remove the chatter, which will improve the speed and quality of the surfaces, but without necessarily choosing damaging methods. Your cutting height will certainly need to be set at the right level, but not too low or for too long.
Well, it's simple then.
Yes, it is, as I think about it anyway.
But by looking to improve the smoothness of a ball roll rather than the length of it, it will radically improve our agronomic outcomes.
It will mean a shift in emphasis towards more beneficial tactics to achieve your agreed targets, but which in the long term will also reduce the likelihood of agronomic outcomes like anthracnose disease occurring.
Your agronomic magic trick.
Yes, and during May, our objective is to build a solid agronomic foundation, prevent damaging or compounding stresses from building, whilst working towards our summer playing quality targets by focusing on surface smoothness primarily.
Well, that is a good start to our Anthracnose Marathon, and hopefully our mindsets are in a better agronomic place for the year ahead.
Yes, a solid mindset is essential, and a focus on smoothness will help. Okay, Glenn, we are now into primo season. Growth is with us, or getting there, and so we should be thinking about the use of plant growth regulators. Tell us, Glenn, what are the benefits of using Primo Max 2? And when do we start using it on the golf course?
Okay, Primo Max 2 is a plant growth regulator that will adjust the way the plant grows. It doesn't suppress growth, it diverts the energy from upright growth into increased tillering, increased root growth, and it condenses down cells. It packs more chloroplasts in to aid that photosynthesis. It also helps to reduce reliance on nitrogen due to less clipping removal, and generally leads to a healthier, more stress-tolerant plant.
Very good. And so when should we start with our programs?
Well, the decision to start using Primo Max 2 depends on your specific grass growth and the rate your site is growing. Okay. We generally recommend starting with a half-rate application, first applied when we start seeing some growth activity, generally late April, early May, and then use a growth degree day program to gauge your next application. We're looking for a nice slow amount of regulation to start the season.
Well, that makes sense because people can actually get themselves into a bit of trouble in that regard, can't they, by going too often, too soon?
Indeed, I see a lot of people starting their programs on a 2-weekly program at the beginning of spring. And what we tend to do then is overlap the applications, meaning we really are compounding that regulatory effect. And that comes at a time when growth isn't naturally and consistently with us, and probably at a time where we actually want some growth and recovery.
Okay, so tell us a bit more about how to use growth degree days in order to help us decide when to apply and how frequently to apply Primo Max 2, because that takes all the guesswork out of it.
Sure. Primo longevity is strongly linked to the temperature. The cooler it is, the longer it will last. The warmer it is, the shorter it will last. So we want to vary those application intervals to ensure we get control that matches the temperatures we have. One way to do this is by using growth degree day models, or GDD, which considers the accumulated temperature above a certain base temperature to predict the optimal timing for plant growth regulator applications. For plant growth regulators, you want to be using a base temperature of 0 degrees and then reapplying every 200 growth degree days. The Growth Degree Day model is a simple yet powerful tool that can help turf managers fine-tune their plant growth regulator programs and maximise their benefits. And the tool can be found on the Syngenta Turf website to make your life a little bit easier.
Okay, so it's the sort of natural degradation of Primo that affects its longevity.
Yeah, it is. The warmer it is, the quicker it will degrade. Soil microbiology is more active and fighting it. And the warmer it is, the more UV light we've got and the faster it's getting broken down. So the warmer the temperature, the tighter the application intervals need to be. And as it cools down, it breaks down slower, so we can extend those application windows out again.
Okay, so this is why we're using the Growth Degree Day model, but it does take a bit of tracking, doesn't it?
It does, but it is fairly simple if you use our website, Growth Degree Day Tracker.
Okay, but what if you don't want to use the Growth Degree Day Tracker? You tend to direct people to the Kirby rule of thumb method, don't you? Can you explain to us what that is?
Sure can. The Kirby rule of thumb method is a variable interval program for plant growth regulator application intervals. This method involves applying plant growth regulators every 4 weeks in the cold, every 2 weeks in the warm, and every 3 weeks when it's in between. By using this method, turf managers can ensure that plant growth regulators are applied pretty close to the right time to achieve the best possible results.
Okay, so in May then, how do those intervals tend to look?
Wow, because May can get variable with its weather and it's a tricky time to get consistent growth, it's an important month to watch.
Yes.
Colder years, using a growth degree day program, we could be between 3 to 4 week application intervals, but in warm years, that should be closer to 15-day intervals. It's more important in these shoulder months than it is at any other time of the year.
Okay, so this is where the Kirby rule of thumb method lets us down a bit, isn't it? Because I suppose it's going to steer us towards 3-week intervals.
Yes, it will, which is better than a 2-week interval or a 4-week interval with no thought put into it.
Yeah, but the Growth Degree Day program will help us get those intervals absolutely bang on.
Yes, it absolutely would. But soon, June and July, most of the time we are going to be pretty consistently bang on a 2-week, 14-day interval to get the most out of it.
Right.
Now, the other thing to watch in May is that base temperature. Using 6 degrees, as some people do, will really skew these numbers in these shoulder months. So use 0 degrees and aim at 200 growth degree days.
Okay, well, that's clear. But what about if we miss the application window?
Don't worry about it. Primo's not a time bomb. It's not going to explode. We just want to hit the next available spray window. Using this method, there is some built-in slack, so it's a useful tool to help you get the best out of the product.
All right, so how do I know then how much Primo Max 2 to apply?
Okay, on putting surfaces, you can apply up to 400 millilitres a hectare. I'd suggest 300 millilitres a hectare is probably the best rate to go with if it's your first time committing to a programme. If you start at half rate, so 150 millilitres a hectare, that will give us a nice, gentle start to the season. You can then use the 200 growth degree day model with a base temperature of 0 as a spray window. It's crucial to monitor your grass growth and adjust the application rate as needed. It's important to follow the label instructions and learn what works to achieve your desired results. But in general, I'd adjust rates and stick to that GDD-based application interval.
Okay, but now there's another plant growth regulator, active ingredient on the market, isn't there?
Yes, there is. There's another plant growth regulator, which is very similar technology to Primo. Now, Primo is the old boy on the block.
Bit like us, Glenn.
Yep, and the other one is the new kid on the block. So I understand people's interest in it. It's new and exciting, but not really that different.
All right, so what are the key differences?
Okay, well, they both mess with the production of gibberellic acid production, which is the plant hormone that prompts cell elongation and increased internodal length. Put simply, gibberellic acid makes the plant want to reach for the sky. The labels are very different though. Primo is permitted for use every 7 days, whereas the other is only permitted to be used every 21 days.
Right, and so a growth degree day program won't really work for that then?
No, 21 days is just too long for a good program in the summer months. You just can't pull those application intervals in tight enough in the higher temperatures. Unfortunately, the label means that it just can't really be optimised in the UK due to the application intervals, which is a real shame as it's simply a labelling issue. And it's a challenge we see in other countries around Europe with Primo. And there we have to position Primo to be used in a different way in the countries where the label doesn't allow it. We have application intervals and numbers of applications restricted on the Primo labels in some countries. So we have to use the product differently. We kind of use it as a short stopper of growth targeted at key events rather than the programmed approach we're lucky enough to have permitted by the authorities in the UK and Ireland. The labelling really does dictate how we can build programs with these products. The way we use the product is always dictated by the label that's been granted by the authorities. And Primo has a great label. Now, another good thing about the Primo label is that the clippings can be composted. That's something that we did loads of work on to get that put on the label.
Yeah, I remember that. And it is good, the amount of work that you've continued to do with Primo, to really support the industry.
Indeed, we used to have to collect the clippings from any Primo treated areas and not allow them to be composted or used as a mulch. which was a real pain.
Okay, so I guess it's inevitable that both plant regulators will be used in programs together, but mainly because the label makes it tricky to use the other one as a standalone product. Have you done much work on the competitor product?
Yes, we've laid out a few trials to understand the benefits and the downsides to these types of products, and there's really not much to split them out. From a growth regulation point of view, they're both very dependent on rates. You'll need to fine-tune those rates to get what you want out of them. From a longevity point of view, the research suggests that Primo is slightly shorter lasting, but that didn't show up in our trials. With Primo slower to react, but that's why we build programs. We want smooth and consistent growth regulation, not hard hits. Both products without some additional nutrition can cause some slight yellowing at first application. That quickly recovers within weeks, though, and POA is always healthy by the midway stage in our trials when coupled with a normal nutrition program. Mm-hmm. And we saw colour lifts from both products by the end of the trial, and that was directly related to the rate. The higher we went, the more colour we had by the end.
Yeah, that is good, isn't it? Is that those chloroplasts, Glenn?
Yep, we're just packing those into a smaller, tighter cell.
Very good.
The trial was, in hindsight, really interesting. But at the time, it was a bit of a disappointment. I think I was hoping for something a bit more conclusive at the time.
Yeah, not huge differences then. So did you look at tank mixing the two? I know people are doing that.
Yeah, we did. And we saw no real benefits in this trial. But interestingly, we saw no downside either. It surprised us. We were expecting some kind of additional growth regulation, but nothing. It's a trial I'd like to run again, actually, as I suspect a programmed approach is probably the best one. But I suspect I'm chasing a bit of a dream as they're so similar in the way they work. I wonder if there's even a kind of optimal way of doing it. It's not like the USA where they've got many variations of plant growth regulators with different modes of actions to build programs with.
Yeah. What about seed heads, Glenn?
Seed head suppression was disappointing, about 20% reduction from both. Okay. Although seed head counting at those low levels is so tricky, it's really difficult to pull stats out on it. We're starting to work on some digital tools to help the assessment process there, but they aren't ready yet. Both products pulled seed heads down into the sward, but neither offering a useful amount of suppression. Primo used to be marketed as a seed head suppression product, but fell short of the market's expectations. So, the timing of any plant growth regulator technology for controlling seed heads is so important. And even in the USA, where they've got completely different technologies available to them, it's still all about timings.
Okay, so if we can't rely on growth regulators for help with seed heads, what can we do?
Well, Henry, let's have a little look.
So, Glenn, what about those annual meadowgrass seed heads?
Okay, Henry, managing putting greens are predominantly poa annua or a mix of poa annua and finer grasses is incredibly tricky in the spring.
Yeah, the challenges during this spring period are twofold, really, aren't they? We're looking at those differential growth levels in the mixed sward with different grasses growing at different rates, and that challenge of annual meadowgrass seed head production, which both impact on the smoothness and the speed and the visual quality of the putting surfaces.
Well, the obvious thing to do here is to reduce the amount of poa annua in the surface, but that is very much a long game strategy.
Yeah, it really is. I think I might start talking more about that. But listen back to the Disturbance Theory episode for some introductory thoughts on that subject.
Good. But if we look over the pond, they have a different strategy to this. They aim to keep poa out for as long as possible and then rebuild or resurface at a point when it reaches unacceptable levels. Or they accept the poa surface and they manage it with plant growth regulators that aren't available to us. The transition from kind of poa back to finer grasses is too long-term a game for the Americans to tolerate. But we're in a position here in the UK where the majority of people are managing a certain amount of poa annua in their swards.
Yeah, they definitely are, I would say. So just how do we go about creating good surfaces during this period of differential growth between the species whilst also trying to contend with those seed heads, at a time when growth is not necessarily guaranteed.
Okay, surface management practices become crucial here to help us achieve those smooth putting surfaces that we're all aiming for. We need to reduce the stress, which amplifies the seeding, and then mechanically reduce the impact of the seeding on the putting surface. So we start with brushing to encourage upright growth and try to remove some of that leggy growth we can see in the bent grasses at this time of year.
Yeah, brush technology has really moved on in recent years. And, I think it's the friendliest of the sward refinement options. But like all things, still shouldn't be overused.
Indeed, grooming and verticutting are far more aggressive and should be used with care. Grooming can be particularly dangerous if not set up properly and used on a regular basis.
Yeah, that damage can really be compounded on those perimeter cuts, can't it?
Yes, it can. Care must be taken with this in our cooler climates. It's easy to unduly stress or weaken our sward at this time of year.
Okay, and you've spoken a little bit about it earlier, but what about mower setup?
Yep, adjusting mower setup can reduce the impact of growth differences between grass species and can really help the impact of those seed heads on the playability.
Yeah, mower setup is so important here, and there will be that desire to lower the height of cut in search of those green speeds.
Yes, our good friend Tom Stidder is taking kind of mower setup to the next level now.
Yeah, we really should get him back on, shouldn't we?
Yeah, we should. I'll have a chat with him.
Yeah.
Rolling, that also plays a part. The frequency of rolling is site specific and depends on the wear tolerances of your turf. Again, excessive rolling can lead to turf injury and more stress than we would desire. And it should be matched to your construction type, your weather conditions and your growth patterns. Most greenkeeping teams will have a number of tools available to them to lean on for managing seed heads and variable growth at this time of year. The key to success is finding the right combination and timing for your site and not overusing. And of course, continuous monitoring and adjusting the agronomic program based on the specific needs of your golf course.
Yeah, it does get tricky with low staffing levels and short weeks that we experience this time of year. But good use of these tools is still critical nonetheless. And, the temptation to lower those height of cuts to eliminate that extra workload will always be there. But a well thought out plan delivered at the right time should always be our focus. Okay, so what about our agronomic input factors?
Okay, water management is crucial for maintaining mixed stands of Poa and finer grasses, as they both have slightly different moisture requirements, but we're trying to hold the Poa in a position where it doesn't get overstressed.
Yeah, that one's tricky, but remember, we shouldn't really be trying to stress the annual meadowgrass to lose it. That just walks us straight into the anthracnose trap. We need to get those soil moisture contents locked in early in a range that suits the target species and use good irrigation practices and quality wetting agents to help us sustain it without, having to rely on irrigation all the time.
And using a moisture meter helps us here, doesn't it, to balance turf health and playability for all the grasses in our swards.
Yeah, it's impossible to do it without it, Glenn.
Yeah, I really hate seeing a dusty soil moisture sat on a shelf. It kind of immediately sets off red flags in my head if I see that. Hand watering plays a big role here, and that's only really effective when coupled with a moisture meter. Overhead irrigation is, of course, useful, and runtime should be definitely adjusted based on individual putting green needs, but it is not the only answer.
No, time committed to hand watering greens is really important here.
Yeah, it helps even out those surfaces. We need to invest some labour into hand watering to even out that desired moisture level, from the levels that have been delivered from our irrigation systems, which aren't always consistent.
Yeah, and if you don't have the labour to commit to this, then a premium wetting agent becomes even more important. Okay, so any other products beyond wetting agents that we can use to help us focus on surface smoothness through this period?
Well, plant growth regulators will help maintain putting surface quality by managing growth rates of all the different grass types in our greens and helping to keep those seed heads lower down in the sward. They don't really reduce seed heads, they just lessen the impact. Plant growth regulator applications are so important through these early months. And this is where I'd love to have access to some of the different plant growth regulator technologies available in the USA, as they would really give us the tools we need in the UK to manage seeding poor annua. They have a whole range of plant growth regulators, whereas we have only two, and they are very similar. They have a whole range of different technologies, meaning they can build programs, and that's the kind of thing that gets me really excited. But unfortunately, they're just not registerable in the UK and Ireland. And the ones that are registerable that we have are just very similar. So that's plant growth regulators. But another important factor is nitrogen. And I know we speak at length about nitrogen impacts, but it has a real ability to reduce stress, doesn't it?
Yeah, fertility programs are a key factor for managing that stress. Well, that ultimately pushes the plant into its seeding or survival mode.
Yeah, and a stressed plant is no good for anyone.
No, it isn't. Is there anything else to think about, Glenn?
Well, the last bit really for me is data collection again, Henry, and the data's analysis. And it's only that will lead to change and improved putting surfaces. Proactive decision making comes from collecting data. I just don't know what seed head data looks like yet or how we measure it. It's something we're working on.
Very good. So go on then, sum up the seed head stroke sward refinement issue then, Glenn.
Okay, so if you have poor annua, it is going to seed. It probably starts earlier than you think, so plant growth regulator timings need to be well timed and early to have any impact. The amount of seeding you will see is directly linked to stress. When you have seed heads, you will need to manage them with mechanical techniques. You probably have loads of tools in your armoury to work those greens, but the more you use them, the more you will stress the plant. The more you stress the plant, the more it will seed. The seed head feedback loop can feel never-ending. But as always, Henry, it comes back to managing the stress.
Oh, very good, Glenn. Okay, Glenn, it's the twist in the tail. What have you got for us this month for our application tip of the month?
Well, we've covered a lot today, so I thought a quick summary of today's application tips would be the best use of this last section.
Very good, Glenn.
Okay, let's start with Overtake, our new selective herbicide. 200 litres a hectare will give the best levels of efficacy because we only want to hit the leaf. That is best achieved by using the purple XC025 nozzles and a pressure between 2 to 3 bar.
Very good.
Now, we also spoke about plant growth regulators, which are not root absorbed, but they are crown and leaf absorbed. So high water volumes are bad news, but targeting the leaf and the crown is very important. Okay. So that means a red nozzle, the XC04, at 2 to 3 bar, and a water volume of around 350 litres a hectare, up to maybe 400.
Okay.
Now, we also touched on wetting agents and the importance of moisture management. Now, for wetting agents, if we're applying those, we want the product off the leaf and down into the soil. So that means white nozzles, the XC08s are great, and as high a water volume as you can go. But keep the pressure between 2 to 3 bar. Increased water volumes should not come from increasing pressure. They should come from slowing down the sprayer.
Yes.
And then irrigating in as soon as possible to aid it reaching the soil.
Yes.
So it's an interesting month with different sprayer configurations needed, but the basics stay the same. Change that nozzle first, then set your pressure at an optimum for that nozzle. Never use the pressure to change the water volume, but do adjust your forward speed if you need to fine-tune the water volume.
Very good. So we've got 3 different sprayer setups in 1 month. But it's so important, isn't it, to make those adjustments if you want to get the best out of those products, which of course we do.
Indeed we do. It is a busy time, Henry.
So that's it, Glenn. Another episode and another set of challenges.
Yes, it's never easy, but if we stay out of the extremes, then May shouldn't be too bad as long as everyone stays patient.
Excellent communication, Glenn. And that reminds me, did we win that award?
No, Henry, we didn't.
Oh, so not a happy ending then.
No. 2 years, 2 nominations, and not a sniff of a trophy. I'd like to say I'm not bitter, but I absolutely am. I've had enough. I'm going to set up my own award category now.
All right, go on then.
Best turf-based agronomic podcast by people called Glenn and Henry.
Right, okay. Well, it's a bit lame, Glenn, I've got to say. And of course, there is a big chance, knowing our listeners, that we might lose.
I know, but I've started a poll on Spotify. I don't care. It's a simple yes or no. If we lose this one, I'm giving up.
Well, I'll tell Charles to vote then.
He's the only one who actually likes us on Spotify at the moment.
Yes, he's a good one. Anyway, Glenn, just like Eurovision, it's not about the winning, it's the taking part that counts.
I guess so, Henry.
Anyway, I think we've already said too much. So take care, everyone, and catch up next time.
Take care, all. Thanks for listening, and catch up next month.
Coletotrichum cereale.
Easy for you to say.
Coletotrichum cereale. Oh. Coletotrichum cereale.
Very good.
Yes, I did it.